Hello and welcome to Mindful Biology. This is the third in a 5-part series about the topic mortality. In the first session, we looked at the presence of death in our lives and how it colors our attitudes and experiences. In the second session, we looked at the biological and other functions served by death. And today, in the next 2 sections, we'll be looking at the times before, during, and after the transition from life to death. It probably would be sensible to cover those 3 periods before, during, and after in that order. However, I've chosen to reverse the order and discuss today the time after death and holding the time before death until the final session, since that's where we live now, in this time before. So it seems like an appropriate place to end, and it's kind of the emphasis of the whole series. So we're talking today then about this period after death has been completed. Because of advances in modern medicine, there is a possibility of people returning from a state of clinical death. That is to say, they die, but the death isn't completed because they're brought back with some form of resuscitation. A substantial percentage of these people come back with profound stories of what happened at some point during their clinical death. That is, during a time when they had neither heartbeat nor detectable brain function. These experiences that they report are called near-death experiences, or NDEs. They have other names, but that's the most common. We're not going to look at those today. We'll be saving that topic for the next session about the transition time. Today, I really want to look at what happens after the NDE, what happens after we're absolutely and definitely beyond any hope of resuscitation, when death has surely been completed. Since no one has come back from that condition in a way that everyone agrees about, there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. The standard biomedical viewpoint, that is to say the view of most working neuroscientists and other academic scientists, is that if the brain is not functioning, there can be no conscious experience, because in that view, conscious experience is a product of brain function. Now, that is a viewpoint. It is not a scientifically proven finding. It was probably a fairly reasonable assumption until these NDEs started being reported so commonly. Yet it does remain a widespread view, and it may be correct. I don't know. But it's clear that not everyone believes that death is the end of consciousness. Religions, of course, have lots of viewpoints about what happens after death, including the idea that there may exist a heaven where at least some of us can go and reside after we have left these biological bodies here on Earth. Other religions believe in a reincarnation, a transmigration of the soul or spirit from the dying person's or the dead person's body to a new body, either human or animal. It's not uncommon, particularly among traditional tribes people, to have a belief in ancestor spirits that remain near the living after they have died. So here, I think that's what the artist is suggesting, with a man who is still alive in the normal earthly realm and his wife, presumably, who has died but still remains near, although in a somewhat different realm of existence. A common belief that many people hold who consider themselves spiritual but who don't adhere to any particular religion may be the idea that our individual consciousness dissolves after death into kind of a vast cosmic consciousness. So these are just possibilities. My emphasis in this talk really isn't going to be about these unknowables. I think it's worth highlighting the fact that there are these differences of opinion, but because we can't be sure what actually happens, I don't see that there's a lot of benefit in spending, a lot of time on it. What I think is more useful is to look at what happens in the world after we have departed. For instance, we could look at an old cemetery and an old grave marker like this one. So here's someone named Elizabeth who died in the late 1890s. And all that remains of her is this rather nondescript stone. Perhaps her name is inscribed in a family Bible somewhere. Perhaps there's a little bit of family lore about someone named Elizabeth. Maybe she even wrote a book of poems or something that preserves her name to some extent. But whoever she was as a person, what she loved and didn't love about the people around her and so on, has largely been lost. It's faded from memory. I think this is frightening for some people, to have this sense that they might be forgotten, obscured by the passage of time. And that fear may motivate the construction of impressive monuments, such as Grant's tomb in Upper Manhattan. And you could say, well, Grant succeeded in a kind of immortality that Elizabeth did not achieve. And yet, few people probably know very much about Ulysses S. Grant today, other than perhaps that he was a Civil War general from the North and had been elected president after the war. Beyond that, probably not much is known about him, and some people probably don't even know that. So even with this impressive monument, Grant, by and large, has faded from memory. There's an attitude in this culture that people that make a bigger splash are somehow more successful at life than those who make smaller ones. And yet there's a fallacy in this kind of thinking that was recognized long ago by Marcus Aurelius, who wrote that the longest surviving fame is but short, and this conveyed through a succession of poor mortals. You look at that and you realize that he's got a point, that even the most impressive amongst us will eventually more or less fade from view. Even if some of our works or even our name is preserved in some fashion, no one is really going to remember us as people. This idea of making a splash could be understood a little better if we look at some actual splashes. So here's water falling on a body of water, and some of the drops are big and some are small. So some of the ripples are big and some are small. But no matter how big the splash, over time, the subsequent activity obscures the earlier. Now, every drop has a permanent rearranging effect on the exact configuration of the molecules in the water. That arrangement would be different if even one of those drops had failed to fall. But the difference that each individual drop makes on that microscopic scale cannot be discerned at the macroscopic, at this larger view. So here we are, popping into the world and making whatever splash we make. And then when we die, the effect that we have on the world will gradually be less and less discernible. In truth, the effect will be permanent and indelible. It's just that it can't be picked out against all the other activity and all the other effects. One way to get a handle on this is to look at a family tree. So here's an example of a family tree. There's a founding couple down at the trunk. They had offspring who also had offspring, and many descendants followed. You could say that that founding couple certainly made a splash in the world. And yet, a descendant of theirs way out on one of the more recent and terminal branches may have only a vague sense as to who that founding couple was. This person owes their genetics to some, small but definite degree to that couple, and yet they may be unaware of that fact. It's quite likely that some of the people in this family tree have only a vague or perhaps no notion at all as to where they came from. And this is not at all uncommon. So the past has an important influence, in fact, a decisive influence on the present. But the way this is propagated forward is a little bit subtle and obscure. So for instance, if the couple in the family was kind and compassionate and generous and so on, then it's likely that their immediate family and the people that knew those family members and so on benefited from that kindness and compassion and maybe emulated it and became kind, generous people themselves. And if instead they were abusive and punishing and hateful, then they probably increased the store of abusive, punishing, hateful behavior in their local environment. Effects like that have consequences over time. They propagate. People treat one another differently according to how they've been treated. So even though we might know nothing about how that couple actually behaved, their behavior could have a cultural influence that we live with today. One way that I look at this is that they formed a kind of compost that became the soil out of which the present grows. So the past is the fertile ground that gives rise to the present. Naturally, someday we will pass from the world and we will have created a kind of compost or soil out of which the future will grow, and it will be influenced by our behaviors, even if our names are forgotten and the details of our lives are unknown. Let's look at this in a little more intimate way. So imagine a person with a circle of acquaintances, some of whom are very close, the immediate best friends, lovers, family, etc. And this person dies, okay? So that immediate group, the inner circle, will be devastated. A big shock of grief will pass through them. They may have trouble functioning for a while. They may need to take time off work. They may have major mood and maybe even health changes. But then there's a further group of social connections, people that aren't quite so intimately attached, who may feel very sad, but their lives won't be quite as powerfully affected. And beyond that, there are even more distant acquaintances who might, have a sense of like, oh, gee, that's too bad, so-and-so died, and then just get on with their lives as if not much had changed, and so on. And if we say, well, let's imagine this person died, here in Marin County, where I happen to be right now, and we went up above this area north of San Francisco, and we could say, well, looking down from this distance, the death of that person probably is going to have no discernible effect. If we didn't get a phone call telling us that that person died, looking from this height, we would never know. Even less likely would we be able to tell from the distance where the whole Earth, looks like a round ball. And we could keep going out. Obviously, if someone is observing us from another galaxy, they're going to have no clue that that person just died, or that we have died when the time comes. This is just part of life. This impact that we have is local and time limited, which isn't to say, that it's not important. It also isn't to say that it doesn't have long-lasting consequences. But the obvious effects are short-lived and local. Of course, that's true of all living things. Nobody bemoans the fact that a dragonfly dies and we forget about it, or a hummingbird, and so on. That's just part of nature, part of life, that animals come and animals go, and they do change their environment, they do have an effect, but the individual does not persist. This is the way of nature. So I believe that the skillful approach here is one of holding both truths in mind. That on the one hand, no matter how big a splash we make in the world, it will eventually be obscured by everything that comes later. And on the other, what we do matters now. It matters to the people around us, and it does shape the future to some degree, even if the effect cannot be picked out against all the other effects. So that dual aspect of, in some ways, our lives are insignificant because we're so small, and in others, they're highly important because they have consequences. That dual aspect, I think, is the sweet spot that we aim for as we think about what happens after we die.